While this podcast isn't rated explicit, the content may not be suitable for younger listeners. Welcome to Sex for Saints, the Christian couple's guide to great sex. I am your host, certified sex and marriage coach, Amanda Lauder. This is episode 388, Sexual Grief. Welcome to Sex for Saints, a podcast for Christian couples. My goal with this podcast is to help enlighten, educate, and inspire you to understand yourself, your spouse, and your sexuality better. I talk about sex in a way you probably haven't heard before. I'm bold, I'm direct, but I keep everything in line with my strong Christian values. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. If you didn't hear the announcement, or you don't follow me on social media, or you don't read my emails, just so you know, the last day to sign up for the 2026 Embrace You retreat is September 30th. You just have to put down your deposit, and then we'll figure things out from there. But if you are interested, or your wife is interested in coming to this retreat, I need you to jump on that right away. There is an ad mid-episode all about it, but I wanted to make sure that you heard about it right up front because it is ending very soon. All right, today we're going to talk about something that I know so many of you experience, but it doesn't really get talked about openly, and that's sexual grief. So I was listening to another podcast recently where the host talked about making grief her companion rather than constantly fighting it. And it really struck me how this applies to our sexual and intimate lives too. Sometimes we need to grieve the gap between what we thought our sex life would be like and what it actually is. And I did an episode a few weeks ago on sexual disappointment and sitting with that disappointment. And a lot of you reached out to me and said something along the lines of like, okay, but what do you do when that disappointment is just over and over and over? And this is the answer, the sexual grief. So what is it? Well, sexual grief is the deep sadness and loss that we feel when our sexual reality doesn't match up to our expectations or hopes. It's mourning the sex life you thought you'd have, the intimacy that you dreamed about, or the connection you believed would come naturally. But here's what makes sexual grief particularly complex. It's often what we call a hidden grief. So unlike other losses in our lives, we rarely talk about sexual disappointments openly. When someone loses a job, we rally around them. When someone's parent dies, we bring casseroles and we offer hugs. But when someone is mourning their sexual expectations, there's silence. And this silence makes sexual grief feel very isolating and sometimes even shameful. You start to think you're the only one struggling, the only one disappointed, the only one whose body isn't cooperating the way you expected. But I'm here to tell you, you are absolutely not alone. Sexual grief can show up in so many ways. Sometimes it's acute, like sobbing in the bathroom after another painful attempt at intercourse. Sometimes it's chronic, a low-level sadness that follows you around, making you feel disconnected from your spouse or from your body. Sometimes it comes in waves, triggered by a movie scene, a friend's comment, or even a church lesson about the beauty of marital intimacy. Now, what makes it even more complicated is that sexual grief often involves grieving something you never actually had. It's not like mourning a person who died or a job you lost. You're grieving a fantasy, an expectation, a hope, which can make you question whether your grief is even valid. Spoiler alert, it is. It absolutely is. So another layer of sexual grief is that it often involves grieving parts of yourself. Maybe you're mourning the spontaneous, passionate person you thought you were. Maybe you're grieving your confidence, your sense of desirability, or your belief that your body was designed to experience pleasure. These identity losses can be just as painful as the physical or relational disappointments. So let me give you some examples of what this might look like. So it might be the newlywed who thought sex would just be instantly amazing. Maybe you've saved yourself for marriage, did everything right, and expected that your wedding night would be magical and that sex would just flow naturally. And instead you're dealing with pain or awkwardness or just disappointment. So you might be grieving the fairy tale that you were sold. Maybe you're the woman who struggles with her body's response. Perhaps you've been married for years, but you've never experienced an orgasm, or your body just doesn't respond the way you see in movies or read about in books. You're grieving what feels like a broken part of yourself, which, by the way, you're not broken. Maybe it's a man dealing with erectile dysfunction. You might be mourning your ability to perform the way that you used to, or the spontaneous sex life that you once had. Maybe it's the couple facing mismatched desires. So one of you wants sex daily, the other monthly. You're both grieving. One person grieves feeling unwanted, and the other grieves feeling pressured. It's the spouse of someone with low libido. So you're grieving the passionate marriage you thought you'd have, the feeling of being desired, or the physical connection you've craved. Maybe you're the spouse who's given up initiating. So maybe you've faced rejection so many times that you've stopped trying altogether. You're grieving not just the sex you're not having, but the part of yourself that used to feel bold and desiring. You're mourning the version of yourself who believed your spouse wanted you. Maybe you're the woman who can't get pregnant. You're not just grieving the baby that you don't have, but you might also be grieving the baby-making sex that was supposed to be joyful and connecting, but has just become clinical and stressful. So I really think it's important to acknowledge this grief. In our culture, especially in religious communities, we're often told to just be grateful for what we have. At least you have a faithful spouse. At least you can have sex at all. Just focus on the emotional connection. But here's what I've learned in my years of coaching. You can't heal what you don't acknowledge. That grief is real, and it deserves to be felt and processed and not pushed down and minimized. So think about it this way. If you dreamed of being a professional musician your whole life, practiced for years, and then discovered you had a hearing condition that made it impossible, would anyone tell you to just be grateful you can still hum? Of course not. They'd acknowledge that you're grieving a real loss, even if you've never actually had what you're mourning. And sexual grief is the same. You're mourning something real, the intimacy you expected, the pleasure you'd hoped for, the connection that you dreamed about. Are you ready for sex camp? My Embrace You Women's Retreat is back, January 29th through February 1st, 2026 in gorgeous St. George, Utah. This is where you'll finally break through every barrier holding you back sexually and fall madly in love with yourself. All but one of my retreats over the last 5 years have sold out, and since I skipped 2025, this one's going to go fast. For just a $500 deposit, you can secure your spot, and your total investment will be between $1,500 and $3,000, depending on the accommodations you choose. But here's the thing. Deposits are due by September 30th. So if you're ready to transform your life, go to amandalauder.com/retreat and reserve your spot before someone else takes it. Now, back to the show. So just like other forms of grief, sexual grief often follows a pattern, though not always in this order. It's very much, all over the place. It's not linear. But there is denial. So this is just temporary. Once we figure out the right technique, everything will be fine. This isn't really a problem. There's anger. This isn't fair. Why did God make me this way? Why can't my spouse just understand what I need? There's bargaining. If I just read one more book, if we just try this new position, if I lose weight, maybe then. There's depression. I'll never have the sex life I want. I'm broken. Maybe I'm just not a sexual person. And then there's acceptance. This is my reality, and that's okay. My worth isn't defined by my orgasms. We can create something beautiful with what we have. So let me be clear. Acceptance doesn't mean giving up. It means accepting your starting point so you can actually work with the reality instead of fighting against it. So in LDS and other conservative religious communities, we often have some unique sources of sexual grief. We have the purity culture hangover. So you spent years being taught that sexual desire was dangerous, and now you're supposed to just flip a switch on your wedding day. And sometimes our bodies and our minds need time to unlearn those messages, and we need to grieve that. There's the sexual awakening timeline. We're often told that good girls don't masturbate or explore their bodies. So you might be just starting your sexual journey years beyond your peers who had more freedom to understand their bodies. And you need to grieve that. There's the comparison trap. So social media and even well-meaning friends might make it seem like everyone else has figured this out, And spoiler alert, they didn't. And then there's the spiritual pressure. So when sex is taught as this sacred, beautiful gift, which I think it is, but the pressure to have mind-blowing experiences can actually create more anxiety and grief when things don't feel sacred or beautiful right away. And we need to grieve that too. So how do we process this grief in a healthy way? So here are some strategies that I often share with my clients. The first is we have to name it. We have to say it out loud that you're grieving. I'm sad that sex is painful for me. I'm mourning the passionate marriage that I thought I'd have. I'm grieving my body's inability to respond the way I want it to. Naming it takes away some of its power. And then the second thing is that we have to feel it fully. So set aside time to actually feel the sadness. Cry if you need to. Journal about it. Talk to a trusted friend or coach. Don't try to fix it or think your way out of it. Just feel it. Third is we need to challenge the stories. So what stories are you telling yourself about what your grief means? I'm broken. I'm not normal. God is punishing me. I want you to challenge the stories. Your grief doesn't define you and it doesn't predict your future. Fourth is to find the gifts. So this might sound strange, but grief often comes with unexpected gifts. Maybe struggling with sexual intimacy has made you more compassionate. Maybe it's forced you to communicate better with your spouse. Maybe it's taught you that your worth isn't tied to your sexual performance. And then fifth is to create new dreams. So instead of mourning what you don't have, start dreaming about what you could have. Maybe your sex life won't look like the movies, but what would feel good for you? What would intimacy look like in your unique relationship? So I want to share with you a story of one of my clients. We'll call her Sarah. Sarah came to me after 5 years of marriage, devastated that she'd never had an orgasm. She tried everything, books, toys, techniques, positions, and she was grieving the sexual woman she thought she was supposed to be. And we spent several sessions just sitting with that grief. She cried and from feeling broken. She mourned the effortless pleasure she saw other women describing. She grieved the disappointment she saw in her husband's eyes. But here's what happened when she stopped fighting the grief and started accepting it. She discovered that she actually did enjoy sex, just not in the way that she expected. She found pleasure in the emotional connection, in the skin-to-skin contact, in feeling desired and desiring her husband. Now, did she eventually learn to orgasm? Actually, yes, she did. But by then, it wasn't the desperate, grief-filled pursuit that it had been before. It was just one more way to experience pleasure, not the definition of whether she was sexually successful or not. Now, I don't want to leave you thinking that accepting grief means giving up hope. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am saying that sometimes we need to grieve our old hopes before we can create new ones. Maybe you need to grieve the idea that sex will always be spontaneous before you can embrace the beauty of planned sex and intimacy. Maybe you need to mourn effortless arousal before you can appreciate the intimacy of working to create the right kind of conditions for desire. Think of it like this. If you planted a garden expecting roses, but sunflowers grew instead, you could spend years mourning your missing roses and missing the beauty of the sunflowers right in front of you. Or you could grieve the roses and then learn to love the sunflowers. So what do you actually want to do with this information? I want to give you some concrete steps. First, talk to your spouse. Share what you're grieving. Help them understand that your sadness isn't about them or your relationship, but is about processing expectations that didn't match reality. Second, get support. Find a counselor, a coach, or a trusted friend who can hold space for your grief without trying to immediately fix it. Third, educate yourself. Learn about sexual response, anatomy, and psychology, not to fix yourself, but to understand yourself better. Fourth, practice self-compassion. Talk to yourself the way you talk to a dear friend going through the same thing. And fifth, focus on what you can control. You might not be able to control your body's responses. You might not be able to control your spouse, but you can control how you communicate, how you prepare, and how you treat yourself in the process. Now, I need to address something that's difficult, but important. Sometimes sexual grief isn't about just a technique or physical challenges or mismatched timing. Sometimes you're grieving because your spouse consistently refuses to work on intimacy issues. They dismiss your concerns or they show no interest in growing together in this area of your marriage. If you've tried communicating, you've suggested counseling or coaching, you've been patient and understanding, you've worked on yourself and are satisfied with how you are showing up in the marriage, but your spouse continues to shut down conversations about intimacy or refuses to acknowledge that there's even an issue, that's a different kind of grief. You're not just mourning the sex life you don't have. You're mourning being in a partnership with someone who won't partner with you on something that matters deeply to you. I want you to hear this really clearly. It's okay to grieve a marriage that isn't working, even if your spouse is a good person in other ways. It's okay to recognize that sexual and intimate compatibility matters to you, and it's okay to make decisions based on that recognition. This doesn't mean that you give up after one difficult conversation or even after a hard year. But if you're dealing with consistent patterns of refusal, dismissal, or contempt around your intimate life, and your spouse shows no willingness to work on it even with professional help, you have some hard choices to make. Now, some of you might be thinking, but I made vows, or divorce is wrong, or what about the kids? These are valid concerns, and I'm not suggesting anyone take this lightly. But I am saying that staying in a marriage where you're not fundamentally compatible and your spouse refuses to work on that incompatibility is also a choice. And it's not automatically the right choice just because it avoids divorce. You deserve to be in a marriage where both people are committed to growing together, including in intimate areas. You deserve a spouse who takes your concerns seriously and willing to work on challenges together. If that's not what you have and your spouse consistently refuses to work toward that, it's okay to grieve that marriage and consider whether it's the right one for you. And I know this is heavy. I know it's not the message that we often hear in our communities, but your sexual and intimate well-being matters. Your happiness matters. Your life matters. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and even for your spouse is to acknowledge whether a relationship isn't working and both people would be better served by finding partnerships where they can thrive. So before I wrap up, I want you to hear this. Your grief is valid. Whatever you're mourning about your sex life, it matters. You're not being dramatic or ungrateful. You're being human. And here's something beautiful about grief. It means you care deeply about something. Your sexual grief means that intimacy and connection matter to you. That's not a weakness. It's a strength. I love that quote that I shared at the beginning about making grief your companion rather than constantly fighting it. What if instead of seeing sexual grief as something to overcome as quickly as possible, we see it as information? What if we let it teach us about what we value, what we hope for, and what we're willing to work toward? Remember, you don't have to have the sex life that everyone else has, or that you think that everyone else has. You just need to have a sex life that works for you and your spouse, that honors your values, and that brings you both joy and connection, whatever that looks like. Your journey is valid, your grief is valid, and your hope for something beautiful, even if it looks different than you originally imagined, that's valid too. All right, my friends, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for being here with me. Don't forget to sign up for the Embrace You Retreat by September 30th. And remember, love is a journey, not a destination. Stay committed, stay passionate, and stay connected. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Like what you're hearing on this podcast? Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Don't forget to leave me a review and share it with your friends.